Live from the recording studios for AP Art History in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's Minimalism. I'm recording upstairs instead of downstairs. You probably don't notice because my kids, my own very flesh and blood, said I had to do these recordings away from them. So I'm going to start with a definition. Minimalism. Their works assert a physical presence through a pared down, simplified format and the use of elementary geometric structures. So print out or at least look at the slide list and follow along with me. It is an art that would seem to be diametrically opposed to pop, yet minimalism shared some of pop's former qualities and methods. The use of repetition in serial forms, a machine aesthetic, and a cool deadpan presentation. And just as pop art enshrined mass-produced consumer items, so minimalist sculpture used mass-produced industrial components. Clever. Replacing manufactured images with units of manufacturing. Again, like pop art, minimalism celebrated materialism, but in its own way. Minimalist artists were preoccupied with the literal nature of materials, with the solid empirical and immediate world. There you go. So we're going to first start with the most easily recognizable minimalist, and that would be Donald Judd. And what he's known for are his repetition of boxes. They're vertical and also horizontal. This one obviously being vertical. There was a funny picture of a little boy napping in between the boxes a couple of years ago. That was kind of funny. Judd started off as an art critic and then became a world famous artist, maybe giving some hope to art critics that they can, go across the line and become great artists as well as writers. This is Untitled 1967. And then this is Untitled 1968. Now, we're going to get into this whole little discussion that we did with Marcel Duchamp because Donald Judd actually didn't make these boxes. He, in fact, created on paper the plans for the boxes, the blueprints, and then gave them to a foundry, and then someone else made the actual sculptures. And we've talked about this before, one way to go with an argument would be that, architects make the plans for a building, but they don't lay bricks with the bricklayers and actually create the building. That's one way to look at it. And these days, a lot of artists will give their plans to actually other, usually it could be a shop or it could be a foundry. That's a big, huge area for young artists to work as fabricators of world famous artists' plans. And then here we are at the Walker. We've talked about it before. The Walker, of course, its strength is in both in minimalism and conceptualism, so it makes sense that they would have a lot of Donald Judds. And then now we're moving down to Marfa, Texas. Judd took over an abandoned Air Force base and created outside sculptures, but also sculptures inside buildings. It is seen as one of the most important pilgrimages for art lovers in the United States. At some point, maybe I'll go down there. I've got some other things on my bucket list, but I'd like to see it. He died, fairly young, kind of, I guess. His children have kept on his legacy. You'll see that in the EMAC shortly. There's another organization that I want you to be familiar with. It's called the DIA Foundation, DIA, and then Foundation. And they have a place outside of New York City now because they sold their New York City building. And they really are the organization that keeps the hope alive. Maybe hope alive is isn't the right way to say it. Keeps the interest in minimalism work. That's kind of their mission And so you might want to look up Dia Foundation if you're interested in minimalism art. Now we're going to go to Ava Hesse. There's an incredible documentary about her that I showed a couple of years ago to students. I wish you could see it free online, but alas, you can't. And they just loved that documentary. Ava Hesse is the most famous of the female minimalists for sure. And there's been so many shows about her as of late, her drawings, her smaller sculptures. Her stock has just really risen lately in the last, I'd say, 10 years. Here's one of her works. And it's an incredibly sad story. She was working with carcinogenic materials and didn't know that they were cancer causing. And she died of a brain tumor at the age of 44, if I'm doing my math right. So just a really incredibly sad story. When Jeremy and everybody in visual arts tells you to put on a mask to protect your health. And then I've always loved these. I believe this is, let me make sure I'm doing it right. Yeah. So this is Repetition 1903, 1968. And then here's a work from 1969. I'm not so sure that you could look at a number of Ava Hesse sculptures and tell they're from the same hand of a same artist. I think she's fairly diverse in her approach, unlike Judd, who you basically know it's a Judd. And then this is maybe one of her most famous ones. That's little pieces of plastic that are embedded in the sides of this mental box. And then last but not least, here's Untitled 1970, the year of her death. And yeah, so there's that. That's Ava Hesse, just a wonderful artist. And now we're looking at Tony Smith's work, and this is on my alma mater's campus, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, very close to the Sheldon Memorial Art Gallery, which was designed by Philip Johnson, no less. And this is what I would see on campus in the 1980s. And the interesting thing about Tony Smith is that he wouldn't have been able to create these sculptures until after World War II. It was during the war that iron making methods were improved upon and allowed him to make something like this, which I've always found really interesting. Lots of college campuses have Tony Smith sculptures, very much so. And then there's this one that's in the sculpture park or garden off of the National Galleries, or in between the two National Galleries, West and East buildings in DC. And then, yeah, that's that. Now, let's take a little fun in my mind at least, little fun detour. Tony Smith's daughter is none other than Kiki Smith. And she's very different. Minimalist works, of course, have no narrative, and Kiki Smith, it's interesting that even though she was around her father a lot and was constantly around his works of art, she decided to take a different sort of approach. This is Lilith. I was fortunate enough to see this sculpture when the Kiki Smith show went through the Walker a number of years ago. And if you know about Lilith, she was the first wife of Adam and was tired of his BS and left the garden, and then Eve had to be made. This is a sculpture that actually is attached to the wall, and it is made out of bronze. And weirdly, if you go up to it, the eyes are from a German doll manufacturer, so the eyes are kind of creepy. So that's Lilith. And then you guys might remember this. I have a poster of this, or something similar to it at least. in my classroom. And this is actually based off of Kiki Smith's body. I think she was put in plaster, and a woman being born out of a deer. That's kind of fun. And then last but not least, this is her monument to the women that were burned at the stake in Salem, Massachusetts. Um, yeah, and I must say that Kiki Smith has an incredibly broad artistic practice. She does prints, sculptures. I don't think she really paints, and that doesn't seem like that much. But just trust me, she does a lot of different things. Now we're gonna move to Carl Andre, and maybe you've been walking in the walker and walked over these steel plates, and that's fine. You can walk on it. At least I've been able to over the last 23 years I've been in the Twin Cities. Um, and yeah, this is just getting down to the solid, empirical, immediate world that was mentioned in that quote by Lisa Phillips in her book. And then here's another one, outside with wood. Carl Andre's still alive. He's a very controversial figure. Um, and the conceptual artist Mondati, it was his wife, and there has been huge talk all the time about how she did not leap from their studio, that he pushed her out. And if you're around feminist art organizations, they tend to protest against him at times. And it's never, there's no empirical proof what really happened. But yeah, Carl Andre is seen as a very much of he's an incredibly controversial figure within the world of art. I'll just say that. Okay, this is a work by Dan Flavin, easily to recognize because he uses these lights. I saw his retrospective in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2004 at the National Gallery, and the light was so intense that the museum guards had to wear sunglasses during the Flavin exhibition. And this brings up an interesting question. What do you do when the fluorescent bulbs burn out? A lot of these fluorescent bulbs are technology from the 1960s. And what happens is that collectors actually very seldom turn on a Flavin sculpture to save the bulbs. And then I read somewhere a long time ago that one of the collectors had bought up some factories output after they had gone out of business so that he could continue to put fluorescent bulbs into his Flavin sculptures. Is it the same piece if a conservator makes, I guess, a new bulb with modern technology? It brings up a lot of kind of fun questions. So that's Dan Flavin. He's a minimalist sculptor of light, I guess you would call him. And here's another one. I don't know if that's not at the Walker. I don't think. There's one similar to it that's the Walker. All right, and then we're going to look at a couple more sculptors, and then we'll look at some actual minimalist painters. This is Larry Bell's work, 1969. Not as well known as some of the other minimalists. And then Saul LeWitt is interesting because he always claimed he wasn't a minimalist. I don't know what that's all about. I mean, Frida said she wasn't a surrealist. And then you get into the question, I'm sure visual kids will say, well, of course, you should respect what the artist says about their own work. So, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think sometimes you can, later in history, question those sort of statements by artists, partly because artists don't want to admit influence from movements and other artists and such. So there you go. But Saul LeWitt said this is not minimalist. Okay, thank you, Saul LeWitt. And then here's another one, corner piece. All right. And then Tilted Arc, which is a very famous story in art history. Sarah was commissioned by the government to create a work of art out in a plaza outside a federal building. And the workers inside the federal building, many of them, were very upset about the work, partly because it got in the way of their walking to, I don't know what, the road or to get lunch or what the deal was. But Tilted Arc was in front of this building from 1981 to 1989. I just looked up the dates. And it's even on your sheet too. Why did I look it up? So basically, the people in the building came to Sarah and said, could you remove it? And he said, if I remove it, I'll destroy it. So you're going to be responsible for the destruction of art. And eventually that's exactly what happened. And of course, you can imagine that there's various different courses in art history in college that talk about this incident. And then this is what I generally think about when I think about Richard Serra, these huge iron plates that have been bended. And you can go inside there. I think this is actually from Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where I've seen this sculpture many times. And you can go inside it and sort of experience it. Sarah is known as, well, let's just be honest, a not so good guy. I'll be diplomatic in how I say that. Yeah, he's not beloved in the art world, that's for sure. Yeah, so that's Richard Serra. And now we're going to move to paintings, minimalist paintings. And the most important of the minimalist painters is absolutely Ellsworth Kelly. And I think he just died recently. I should update this slide list. This is called Black Curve. And this is red, green, blue. Now, people like my dad, of course, would erupt and say, I could do this. Why am I not a famous artist? And the answer I always have is, but you didn't. It was Kelly who was one of the minimalist artists of note. And then this is another one, the last one that I will show to you. And I think there's this one or something similar at the Walker, actually. All right, and then here's Kenneth Nolan, who, be interesting to compare this to Jasper Johns's Target. Similarly influenced, I guess. Another example of a minimalist painter. And then Frank Stella, I actually did a little research for a professor. It didn't go very far, but on his series called The Homage to a Square. And he did a number of these paintings in honor, I guess, of the square, and this is one of them. And then last but not least, a female minimalist painter, Agnes Martin, whose stock has gone up quite recently. There was a show across the pond, I think in London, with her. And yeah, so as you can see, a little bit of a graph there. And that's kind of what she's known for. And she's pretty easy to recognize, actually. Yeah, okay. I told you it was going to be quick. Under 20 minutes. That is minimalism. And I'll give you a question for you guys to answer on email tomorrow. All right. Thanks. Bye.